Did you know that medieval grandmas and grandpas faced dangers even worse than the Black Death? What if their own trusted neighbors turned out to be their worst nightmares? All between the years 500 and 1500 AD. Number 1. The debt trap and false loan scam. In the bustling marketplaces of medieval Europe, where the aroma of baking bread mingled with the smell of horse dung and unwashed humanity, life revolved around trade, harvest, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. For many, particularly those in their twilight years, a sudden crop failure, a prolonged illness, or the untimely death of a working son could plunge a household into despair. This was where the unscrupulous moneylender, sometimes a merchant, sometimes a member of a persecuted group, but always a figure operating on the fringes of accepted social norms, saw an opportunity. These individuals offered what seemed like a lifeline, a loan. Yet these loans were often no lifeline at all, but rather a carefully constructed snare designed to strip the elderly of their hard-won assets. The typical scenario began subtly. An elderly farmer, let us call him Thomas, a man whose hands were gnarled from a lifetime of tilling the land, might face a harsh winter. His granary was almost empty, and his wife Agnes was suffering from a persistent cough. Their children had moved away, seeking fortunes in larger towns, leaving Thomas and Agnes to fend for themselves. Thomas needed seed for the spring planting, perhaps a few shillings to buy medicine for Agnes, and some coarse grain to keep their remaining livestock alive. He knew the local lord sometimes offered assistance, but that came with its own set of obligations, often demanding extra labor during harvest. He certainly could not ask for charity, a concept often seen as dishonorable for a man who had always worked his own plot. Then a rumor spread through the village about Master Elms, a man who recently arrived from a distant town, setting up shop near the weekly market. Elms was known for his fine textiles and his willingness to extend credit. A rare commodity in a society where ready cash was scarce, Thomas, desperate, approached Master Elms. Elms greeted him with a genial smile, offering a cup of watered wine. Thomas explained his predicament, requesting a small sum, perhaps 2 silver shillings. Master Elms nodded gravely, acknowledging the hardships of the season. He produced a parchment rolled tightly and dipped a quill into an inkwell. 2 shillings, you say? Elms mused, his eyes twinkling. A trifle, good Thomas, a mere trifle, but money is dear and I have my own expenses. A small interest, you understand, for the risk I take. Thomas, relieved that Elms was willing to help, agreed. He did not fully grasp the concept of interest rates, a relatively new and often confusing idea for many in an agrarian society. Elms explained it simply. For every shilling borrowed, Thomas would repay 1.5 shillings when the next harvest came in. This, Elms assured him, was a generous offer. In truth, the rate was exorbitant, far exceeding what any legitimate merchant or noble might charge, if they even offered such terms. Thomas focused on the immediate relief, signed the document, or more accurately made his mark on the parchment, as literacy was a luxury few farmers possessed. The document, of course, was not as simple as Elms described. Buried within its flowing script were clauses Thomas could not read, provisions that would seal his fate. One such clause might stipulate that if Thomas failed to repay the full sum on the exact date agreed, the interest rate would double or even triple with each passing week. Another clause could state that in lieu of monetary repayment, Thomas's small plot of land, his ancestral home, would become collateral. This was often not clearly stated but implied or hidden in legalistic language. Medieval legal systems were complex and disputes over land were common. A written document, even one signed by an illiterate man, held significant weight in a lord's court, especially if the moneylender had connections or a reputation for fairness. That he carefully cultivated in public harvest arrived, but the yield was poor. Thomas had paid for the seed and medicine, but the remaining money was barely enough for food. He had hoped for a bountiful harvest, enough to repay Master Elms, and still have enough to feed his family through winter. But the rain had been scarce, and the crops withered. When Master Elms came to collect, Thomas could only offer him 1 shilling and a few copper pennies. Elm's genial smile vanished. He produced the parchment, unrolled it with a theatrical flourish, and pointed to the hidden closet. Thomas Elms said, his voice now hard as stone, "You are in breach of our agreement. The terms are clear. For every day you delay, the debt grows. Your land, Thomas, your land is forfeit." Thomas protested, his voice hoarse with fear. He pleaded, explaining the poor harvest, the illness of his wife. But Elms was unmoved. He had foreseen this possibility. These moneylenders often targeted the elderly and the vulnerable, precisely because they were less likely to have powerful kin or allies to defend them. Their physical strength was waning. Their social standing often diminished. Thomas had no recourse. The local reeve, the Lord's representative, was a man of law, and law in this period was often a tool for those with power and written documents. The reeve, upon reviewing the document, might confirm Elm's claim. Thomas and Agnes found themselves dispossessed of their small farm, forced to become tenants on land they once owned, or worse, reduced to begging on the roads. The moneylender Elms now owned the land which he could then rent out to another struggling family. Effectively securing a long-term income stream, this was a common tactic. Less about immediate profit from interest and more about acquiring property through legal loopholes and the desperation of the poor. Records from manor courts in England and judicial archives in France tell of countless such cases where elderly peasants lost their homes, their livestock, and their dignity to predatory lending practices. A document from the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds in the 13th century records how a family unable to pay a small debt had their cottage and garden seized by a monastic official acting as a moneylender. The official then allowed the family to remain as tenants, but now they paid rent to the abbey for their own home. Sometimes the scam involved outright forgery. A cunning individual might forge a loan document claiming an elderly person, perhaps one suffering from a fading memory, owed them a significant sum. They might produce a document with a forged signature or mark, claiming the elder had taken a loan for a previous illness or a forgotten purchase. Without strong identification systems or widespread literacy, proving such a document was a fabrication was incredibly difficult. An elder who had no living family to vouch for them, or whose mental faculties were truly failing, might be easy prey for such a claim. The accused would often have no memory of the transaction, but the written word held immense power. In a society where verbal agreements were common but easily denied, a piece of parchment, even a fake one, could be devastating. The loan might also be a disguised way to acquire skilled labor. An elder, perhaps a skilled weaver or a retired carpenter, might be offered a loan with the unspoken expectation that they would work off the debt through their craft. The terms would be vague and the debt would always seem to grow, keeping the elder in perpetual servitude. A document from a German city in the 14th century describes how a baker, too old to manage his shop, was lured into a loan agreement that effectively forced him to continue working for the creditor, baking bread at meager wages for years with the original loan, never truly diminishing. The baker's children, having moved away, were unaware of his predicament until it was too late, and the shop was irrevocably tied to the moneylender. These debt traps were not just financial ruin, they were social destruction. Losing one's land meant losing one's status, one's connection to the community, and often one's very means of survival. For the elderly who had spent their lives building a small measure of security, such a loss could be catastrophic. They had no pension, no social safety net. Their land was their future, their legacy, their dignity. When that was stripped away by a predatory loan or a fabricated debt, the consequences were profound, leaving them adrift in a harsh, unforgiving world. The law intended to protect could become a weapon in the hands of the unscrupulous. As long as they knew how to manipulate its strictures and prey upon the vulnerability of those whose lives were nearing their end. Number 2. The protection racket and fake night scam. In the chaotic landscape of medieval Europe, where central authority was often weak, and justice was a concept frequently determined by the strength of one's sword arm or the size of one's retinue, the elderly, like all vulnerable groups, often sought security. They had lived long enough to see banditry, feuding lords, and roving bands of desperate former soldiers wreak havoc on peaceful communities. This fear of violence and instability was a fertile ground for a particularly insidious scam, the protection racket, often spearheaded by individuals masquerading as legitimate protectors, such as knights, or simply strongmen with a penchant for extortion. Consider a small, isolated village nestled in a valley. Its homes thatched with straw, its fields ripe with corn. The villagers were mostly farmers, weavers, and a few artisans, elderly among them who had spent their lives cultivating their land and raising their families. They possessed modest wealth in the form of livestock, harvested grain, and perhaps a few silver coins hidden beneath a hearthstone. News traveled slowly but fearfully through the valley. A band of rough-looking men, some dressed in rusty armor, others in leather jerkins, had been seen on the outskirts of the next village, demanding tribute from the local reeve. They claimed to be protectors, ensuring the safety of the populace from unseen threats, or from themselves. Into this atmosphere of unease rode a man who introduced himself as Sir Gareth. A knight-errant, sworn to uphold justice and defend the innocent, he rode a sturdy horse. His armor was polished, and a well-maintained sword hung at his hip. He presented himself with an air of authority, speaking of his valiant deeds in distant lands, tales of battles fought and bandits vanquished. The villagers, awestruck and perhaps a little intimidated, gathered around him. Sir Gareth declared that the region was rife with danger, plagued by brigands and lawless men. He, with his small but loyal band of followers, offered a solution. For a modest fee paid annually by each household, he would guarantee their safety. He would patrol the roads, stand guard at night, and ensure no harm came to their homes or their elder. To the aging villagers who remembered past raids and the constant threat of violence, this sounded like a godsend. Their own lord, perhaps a distant count or a busy baron, rarely visited their remote village. They had no strong walls, no watchtower, and only a handful of young men capable of wielding a pitchfork in defense. Sir Gareth's offer of protection seemed a small price to pay for peace of mind. Oldalera, who lived alone with her flock of chickens, fretted about thieves, making off with her meager savings. Old Master Bran, whose eyesight was failing, worried about someone stealing his prize sow. So the villagers, many of them elders, agreed to pay Sir Gareth his protection fee. They handed over precious grain, a few silver pennies, or a portion of their wool. For a time, an uneasy quiet settled over the village. Sir Gareth's men patrolled the outskirts, their presence a visible deterrent, or so it seemed. The truth was, Sir Gareth and his men were often the very brigands they claimed to protect the village from. Their patrols were merely opportunities to scout other villages for future extortion or to ensure that no genuine strongmen would muscle in on their territory. The threats they spoke of were often fabricated or, at best, exaggerated versions of minor incidents. They themselves might have orchestrated the scam evolved. After a few months, Sir Gareth would return, claiming that new, more dangerous bandits had appeared, requiring a larger contribution to ensure continued protection. He might stage a small, easily repelled raid on a distant barn, attributing it to a new, formidable enemy, thus demonstrating the ongoing need for his services. The elderly, already fearful, and having invested their faith and resources in his protection, were particularly susceptible to these escalating demands. They often lacked the physical ability to resist or the social connections to appeal to a higher authority. Their long lives had taught them that avoiding conflict was often the best path, and paying a fee seemed simpler than risking outright confrontation. Another variation involved the fake knight, or false noble. A man, perhaps a disinherited son or a deserter, would travel through the countryside, claiming to be a legitimate feudal lord or a high-ranking knight passing through. He would demand hospitality, gifts, and even attacks from the local population, including the elderly. He would threaten the villagers with the wrath of his non-existent overlord or the might of his phantom army if they refused. In a time of limited communication and widespread illiteracy, it was difficult to verify such claims. A well-spoken man, dressed in fine clothes with a few rough followers, could easily intimidate a small, isolated community. Records from the Champagne fairs in France in the 12th century speak of impostors who would arrive claiming to be royal tax collectors or representatives of powerful dukes, demanding goods and money from merchants and local populations. The elderly, often less mobile and more reliant on established authority, were prime targets for such deception. One particular instance recounted in an old monastic chronicle from the German lands tells of an aging widow, Lady Bertha, who managed a modest estate. A man arrived at her gates claiming to be a distant cousin of the local duke, sent to survey the land for a new royal tax. He presented a forged seal and spoke with an air of immense importance. Bertha, a woman of 80 summers, frail but sharp-witted, welcomed him as was custom. The duke's cousin then proceeded to demand a significant sum of gold, claiming it was an advance on the new tax, and threatened to report her disloyalty to the duke if she refused. Bertha, though suspicious, knew the wrath of a duke could mean ruin. She gathered her most precious gold coins, a lifetime savings, and handed them over. Only weeks later, when the true duke's representatives visited, did she discover the deception. The impostor had vanished, and her gold was gone forever. The protection racket also thrived on the deliberate creation of insecurity. Sir Gareth and his ilk might secretly send their men to steal a few sheep from a field at night, or to knock over a few barrels of ale in the village square. They would then dramatically apprehend one of their own men, making a show of punishing him, thereby proving their effectiveness to the fearful villagers. This theatrical display reinforced the idea that danger was omnipresent, and that Sir Gareth was the only one capable of holding it at bay. The elderly, often unable to participate in nightly watches or physical defense, felt even more dependent on this imposed protection. These scams exploited a deep-seated desire for safety in a dangerous world. For the elderly, who had seen enough of life's unpredictable horrors, the promise of peace, however costly, was alluring. They had no standing army to call upon, no immediate recourse to justice beyond their local lord, who might be miles away or uninterested in the affairs of a small village. The fake knight or the protection racketeer stepped into this vacuum, offering a false sense of security, while systematically draining the community, particularly its most vulnerable, of its resources. It was a profound betrayal of trust, leaving communities feeling violated and exposed, robbed not just of their coin, but of their peace of mind, perpetually living under the shadow of a threat that was both real and manufactured by their supposed protectors. Number 3. The fate heir and long-lost relative. Scam. In medieval society, lineage and inheritance were everything. Land, property, and even social standing were passed down through generations. A family's name, its history, and its wealth were tied to its ability to produce heirs. For elderly individuals, particularly those who were childless, widowed, or whose legitimate heirs had died young or gone missing. In wars or crusades, the prospect of an estate without a clear successor was a source of great anxiety. This societal emphasis on inheritance created a perfect breeding ground for a particularly cruel scam: the appearance of a long-lost relative, or a fake heir eager to claim a piece of an aging elder's wealth. Imagine Lady Eleanor, a venerable widow of 70 years, living in a comfortable manor house on the outskirts of a bustling town. Her husband, Sir Reginald, a minor noble, had passed away years ago, leaving her with a considerable estate, but no surviving children. Her closest relatives were distant cousins whom she barely knew. Eleanor was a kind woman, but increasingly frail, and her memory was beginning to play tricks on her. She worried constantly about the future of her lands and who would care for her loyal retainers after her death. One autumn afternoon, a young man arrived at her gates, dressed in traveler's clothes, but with an air of polished confidence. He introduced himself as Thomas, the son of her husband's long-lost brother, Robert. Robert, he claimed, had gone off to fight in a distant crusade many decades ago, but Thomas presented a detailed, though entirely fabricated story. He spoke of his father's survival, his long years in captivity, and his recent death, having finally entrusted Thomas with the task of finding his remaining kin and reclaiming his rightful place in the family line. He even produced a faded, seemingly ancient letter, though it was skillfully forged, that appeared to be from Robert, mentioning specific family anecdotes that only someone close to the family would know. These facts were often gleaned from servants, local gossip, or careful observation of the elders' habits and conversations. Lady Eleanor, initially cautious, found herself drawn in by Thomas's charm and his convincing story. He bore a fleeting resemblance to her late husband's family, a resemblance carefully cultivated through subtle cues of posture and mannerisms. He spoke of family events that Eleanor vaguely remembered, small details that seemed to confirm his tale. The young man played the part perfectly, respectful, attentive, and seemingly devoted to his aunt. He would sit by her side listening patiently to her stories, feigning interest in her dwindling collection of family portraits. He complimented her home, praised her generosity, and offered to assist her with the increasingly complex affairs of the estate. The purpose of Thomas's presence was not immediate theft. It was a long game, a slow poison designed to win Eleanor's trust and eventually her favor. In her will, he would subtly suggest that since he was the only surviving heir of her husband's line, it would be proper for her to include him in her will, ensuring the family name continued to prosper. He might claim to be in financial distress, subtly hinting that a small loan from her, an advance on his inheritance, would greatly assist him in establishing himself or in returning to collect his father's remaining effects. This was often a test, a way to gauge her willingness to part with money. As Eleanor's health declined further, Thomas's influence grew. He might isolate her from true friends and legitimate advisors, subtly undermining their character or trustworthiness. He would manage her affairs, ensuring all correspondence passed through him, preventing any outside interference or discovery of his deception. He might even coerce her into signing documents that transferred portions of her property to him, while she was mentally vulnerable, claiming they were merely administrative papers for the estate. Her lack of strong vision, or her deteriorating mental state, made her an easy target for such trickery. In some cases, the scam was even bolder. An elderly individual, perhaps childless or having lost touch with their relatives, might be approached by someone claiming to be a child they gave up for adoption decades ago, or a child they never knew existed from a forgotten liaison. Such stories played on the deep emotional desires for family and connection, especially for those facing the loneliness of old age. A woman might be approached by a young man claiming to be her son, born out of wedlock, and given to a distant family to avoid scandal. He would bring a story of hardship and a longing for connection, slowly working his way into her life, and eventually her estate. These impostors were often very convincing, armed with details gathered from local gossip or parish records, creating a narrative that felt almost too perfect to be false. Records from medieval courts, such as the Court of Common Pleas in England, contain instances of disputes over inheritance, where one party was accused of being an impostor. While these cases often involve legitimate family squabbles, they highlight the prevalent anxiety over lineage and the difficulty of verifying identities. In a time without photographs or formal birth certificates, a claimant needed only a convincing story, a few supporting witnesses, often paid actors, and a plausible connection to the family. The burden of proof often fell on the elderly, who were least equipped to gather evidence or withstand the pressure of a legal battle. One documented case from a French province in the 14th century details how an aged baroness, whose only son had died without issue, was approached by a man claiming to be her grandson from a secret marriage her son had made before his death. The impostor arrived with a wife and child, presenting a fabricated marriage contract and letters supposedly from the deceased son, the Baroness, longing for a grandchild, welcomed them with open arms. Over the next few years, the impostor slowly took control of her estate, convincing her to sign over deeds and allocate funds for his maintenance and the education of his supposed son. When the Baroness finally died, her distant, legitimate relatives discovered the deception, but only after much of the wealth had been dissipated or legally transferred. The impostor and his family had vanished, leaving behind a trail of manipulated documents and a devastated legacy. The impact of such a scam was not just financial, it was a profound emotional betrayal. The elderly individual, seeking comfort and companionship in their final years, found themselves manipulated and exploited by someone they had come to trust as family. The loss of wealth was devastating, but the shattering of their sense of security and the realization that their deepest emotional needs had been used against them left an enduring scar. The impostor might spend months, even years, cultivating this relationship, making the betrayal all the more cruel when the truth, if it ever surfaced, finally revealed itself. The lack of modern verification methods, coupled with the deeply ingrained social importance of family and inheritance, made the elderly a prime target for those who sought to gain wealth through deceit and a fabricated lineage. Number 4. The bogus investment and hidden treasure scam. The medieval world, while rooted in agriculture, was also one of nascent trade, expanding horizons, and an enduring belief in alchemy, hidden riches, and miraculous discoveries. For the elderly, whose physical labors were diminishing and whose savings were often small but hard-won, the promise of a sudden windfall, a chance to secure their remaining years in comfort, could be irresistible. This made them prime targets for bogus investment schemes and tales of hidden treasure, scams that played on desires for security and a lingering belief in magic and destiny. Consider Master Ethelred, a retired stonemason, his hands still strong but his back perpetually aching. He had accumulated a decent sum of silver over a lifetime of hard work, enough to buy a comfortable cottage and ensure a modest life for himself and his aging wife, Bertha. They had no children, and Ethelred often worried about their future, about what would happen if their savings ran out before their lives did. He had heard tales of merchants growing rich overnight, of alchemists turning base metals into gold, and of long-lost Viking hordes unearthed by chance. One day, a mysterious stranger arrived in Ethelred's village, a man named Bartholomew. He was well-dressed, spoke with an air of learned authority, and carried a small, ornate wooden box that he guarded carefully. Bartholomew claimed to be a scholar, a man of profound knowledge in forgotten arts. He began to subtly spread rumors in the village, speaking of ancient texts he had deciphered, texts that revealed the locations of hidden treasures or the secrets of transforming lead into gold. He spoke of lost Roman coins, of the forgotten burial sites of powerful kings, or of rare minerals that could fetch a king's ransom in distant markets. Bartholomew sought out individuals like Ethelred, those with a small but identifiable amount of wealth. He would approach them with a hushed tone, presenting his discovery as a secret he could share only with a select few, those who possessed the vision to understand its true potential. He might produce a crudely drawn map, seemingly ancient and brittle with enigmatic symbols and references to forgotten landmarks. Or he might display a small vial of shimmering liquid, claiming it was a rare elixir, the key to transforming common metals. The core of the scam was the investment. Bartholomew would explain that while the treasure was real, or the alchemical process viable, he lacked the immediate funds to complete the work. He needed a small sum to acquire crucial materials, to hire a small team to assist in the dig, or to purchase rare herbs for his alchemical experiments. He might ask for a few silver pieces to buy special divining rods, or to pay for transport to a remote, supposedly treasure-filled location. He promised a magnificent return on this investment, a share of the vast riches to be unearthed, or a portion of the gold he would create. He might even show a small, genuine gold nugget or an antique coin, claiming it was a sample of what awaited them. Ethelred, cautious by nature, was initially skeptical, but Bartholomew was persuasive. He cited ancient authorities, spoke of providential signs, and presented himself as a man of science, not a charlatan. He emphasized the exclusivity of the opportunity, making Ethelred feel privileged to be chosen. He played on Ethelred's fears of financial insecurity in old age, and his desire to leave a lasting legacy for his wife. He painted vivid pictures of a life of ease, free from worry, if only Ethelred would contribute a small sum. Finally, Ethelred agreed to invest a portion of his savings. He handed over 10 silver shillings, a substantial sum for a retired stonemason. Bartholomew thanked him profusely, promising to return in a few weeks with news of their impending fortune. Of course, Bartholomew never returned. He would vanish, moving on to the next village, the next unwitting victim, leaving Ethelred with nothing but a worthless hand-drawn map and a crushing sense of foolishness. The rare herbs were common weeds, the divining rods mere sticks, and the ancient texts nothing more than scribbled gibberish. Sometimes the treasure was not hidden in the earth, but in a distant land. A scammer might appear claiming to be a returning crusader or a merchant from the East. They would weave fantastic tales of exotic goods, rare spices, and untold riches, claiming to have discovered a secret market or a rare commodity that would bring immense profit if only someone would invest a small sum to acquire it. They might even promise shares in a non-existent trade venture, claiming a need for capital to equip a ship or purchase goods for a journey. The elderly, often less worldly and more confined to their local communities, might be easily swayed by such grand adventurous tales, especially if they dreamed of a life beyond their humble existence. A chronicle from a German merchant guild in the 13th century recounts the story of an aging widow, Frau Margaret, who ran a small alehouse. A man claiming to be a returning pilgrim from the Holy Land, speaking with a convincing accent and displaying a few worn relics, persuaded her to invest her life savings in a scheme to import rare silks and spices from the Orient. He claimed he had secured a special deal with a distant potentate, and that with her modest contribution she would reap 20 times her investment upon his return. Margaret emptied her coffers, eager to secure her remaining years. The pilgrim disappeared, and Margrethe died in poverty. Her dreams of exotic silks shattered. The bogus investment scam also manifested in the realm of alchemy. With the widespread belief in the possibility of transmuting base metals into gold, many charlatans posed as learned alchemists. They would approach wealthy or ambitious elders, claiming to be on the verge of a breakthrough, needing only a small investment to purchase rare chemicals, build a specialized furnace, or acquire secret texts. They would perform small, seemingly miraculous tricks to convince their victims, such as secretly swapping a base metal for a piece of gold at the opportune moment. The elderly, perhaps dreaming of leaving their heirs an even greater fortune, or simply fascinated by the promise of magic, would hand over their precious coin, only to find the alchemist vanished and their money gone, leaving behind a laboratory full of worthless soot and shattered retorts. The core vulnerability of the elderly in these scams was often their desire for security, their hope for a better future for themselves or their descendants, and their susceptibility to grand promises in a world where true opportunities for wealth were scarce. Their accumulated savings, however modest, represented a tempting target. They might also be less mobile and therefore unable to travel to verify claims, or less connected to wider networks of information that might expose such deceptions. The perpetrators skillfully played on these hopes and limitations, creating elaborate fantasies of wealth and opportunity that led only to ruin. The impact was not just financial, but a profound loss of hope and a bitter lesson in the deceptive nature of false promises. Number 5. The pious donation and soul insurance scam. In the spiritual landscape of medieval Europe, the Church held immense power over the minds and hearts of the populace. Life was often brutal and short, and the prospect of the afterlife, whether glorious heaven or eternal damnation, loomed large. For the elderly, facing the inevitable end of their earthly journey, securing a favorable passage to the next world became a paramount concern. This deep-seated fear of damnation and the fervent desire for salvation created a fertile ground for one of the most widespread and insidious scams of the era, the pious donation or soul insurance racket orchestrated by unscrupulous clerics or those posing as religious authorities. Consider Dame Isolde, a noblewoman of considerable age and wealth, whose life had been filled with both joy and sorrow. She had seen loved ones perish from plague and war, and her own health was failing. Her thoughts increasingly turned to her soul and its fate after death. She had lived a good life, donated to charity, and attended Mass regularly, but the fear of purgatory, or worse, hell, gnawed at her. She desired to ensure her place in heaven, to make amends for any lingering sins, and to pray for the souls of her deceased family members. A priest, Father Benedict, newly arrived in her parish, noticed Dame Isolde's piety and her advanced years. He was a nidoct speaker, his sermons filled with vivid descriptions of the torments of hell and the bliss of paradise. He spoke of the power of prayers, of good works, and of the immense spiritual benefits of generous donations to the Church. He would visit Dame Isolde, offering spiritual counsel, listening patiently to her anxieties. Father Benedict subtly began to emphasize a particular point, that the path to salvation could be expedited and made more certain through significant acts of charity, especially those directed towards the Church itself. He spoke of endowing monasteries, commissioning elaborate altarpieces, or funding special masses to be said for the donor's soul in perpetuity. He might present a scroll detailing the benefits of such a donation, a reduced time in purgatory, a direct path to heaven, or special intercessions from saints. He might even produce forged letters or pronouncements from a distant bishop or abbot, seemingly endorsing such practices and promising divine favor. Dame Isolde, desperate for reassurance, listened intently. Father Benedict did not ask for money directly, but rather suggested ways she could invest in her eternal salvation. He might propose that she donate a significant portion of her land to a new monastery he planned to build, or that she fund the construction of a new chapel, ensuring her name would be inscribed within it forever, along with prayers for her soul. He stressed the urgency, implying that time was short and that such acts of devotion would secure her place in the heavenly host. The scam lay in the manipulation of faith and fear. While genuine pious donations were common and respected, the unscrupulous cleric would exaggerate the spiritual benefits, create non-existent projects, or simply pocket the funds. The new monastery might never be built, the chapel might remain a drawing on parchment, or the special masses might never be said. The funds, intended for spiritual purposes, would line the pockets of the corrupt cleric or his accomplices. For the elderly, who had less time to realize the deception and often placed absolute trust in religious figures, the scam was highly effective. They were not seeking financial return. They were seeking eternal peace, a commodity that was priceless in their eyes. Another common tactic involved the sale of indulgences. While indulgences were a legitimate, though often controversial practice within the Church, allowing for the remission of temporal punishment for sins, they were frequently abused. Unscrupulous peddlers, sometimes genuine church representatives, sometimes impostors, would target the elderly, claiming that for a specific sum of money they could purchase a full indulgence, guaranteeing immediate entry to heaven for themselves or even for deceased relatives. They would create an atmosphere of panic, emphasizing the horrors of purgatory and the limited time available to secure such a powerful spiritual boon. The elderly, burdened by guilt over past sins or grief for lost loved ones, would often empty their meager savings to purchase these tickets to heaven, believing they were buying salvation for their souls. Historical records, such as those from the 15th century sale of indulgences that provoked Martin Luther's protest, demonstrate how deeply intertwined financial transactions became with spiritual promises, and how susceptible the faithful, especially the elderly. A charlatan might claim to possess a bone of a saint, a piece of the true cross, or a vial of holy oil with miraculous healing and soul-saving properties. They would travel from village to village, putting on theatrical displays of healing or blessing, then selling small portions of their relics or offering blessings for a fee. The elderly, often suffering from age-related ailments and seeking spiritual comfort, would flock to these figures hoping for a miracle for their bodies and their souls. They would spend their last pennies on a piece of wood, a scrap of cloth, or a sip of ordinary water, believing it held divine power. The miracles, of course, were illusions, and the relics, forgeries. Records from various medieval cathedrals and pilgrimage sites show an astonishing number of duplicate relics of the same saint, a testament to the thriving market in religious artifacts and the easy deception of the faithful. The pious donation scam thrived on illiteracy and a lack of theological understanding among the general populace. The complex doctrines of sin, penance, and salvation were often simplified and manipulated by those who sought personal gain. The elderly, having spent their lives in an era where the church was the ultimate authority, were particularly vulnerable to the pronouncements of a seemingly holy man. They had been taught from birth to revere priests and to believe in the absolute power of divine intervention. Their fear of the unknown, combined with a profound desire for eternal peace, made them easy targets for anyone who promised salvation in exchange for a donation. The impact was not just a loss of wealth, but a profound disillusionment, where faith itself was twisted into a tool of exploitation, leaving the victim feeling cheated not just of their money, but of their spiritual well-being. Number 6. The miracle cure and snake oil scam. Life in medieval times was fraught with disease and suffering. Medical understanding was rudimentary, relying heavily on herbal remedies, bloodletting, and often superstition. For the elderly who faced the inevitable decline of their bodies from aching joints to failing eyesight, the prospect of a miraculous cure for their ailments was a powerful lure. This vulnerability, combined with a widespread belief in magic, divine intervention, and the exotic, created fertile ground for the miracle cure or snake oil scam, perpetrated by charlatans who promised extraordinary healing for a price. Picture old Master Godfrey, a once robust blacksmith now stooped with age, his hands gnarled by arthritis, his vision blurred. He suffered from constant pain in his knees and found it increasingly difficult to ply his trade. He had tried every known remedy, from the village herbalist, from willow bark poultices to elaborate incantations, but nothing brought lasting relief. He yearned for a return to his youthful vigor, even a small respite from the relentless aches. One day, a colorful wagon, pulled by a scruffy horse, arrived in the village square. From it emerged a man dressed in flamboyant robes, adorned with strange amulets and a turban. He called himself Dr. Alaric, a physician of the East, claiming to have traveled to distant lands and discovered ancient secrets of healing. He set up a makeshift stage, drawing a crowd with loud pronouncements and theatrical gestures. Dr. Alaric began his pitch, speaking in flowery language of ailments he could banish from the fevers of youth to the infirmities of old age. He produced a small, corked bottle, filled with a dark, oily liquid, shimmering faintly in the sunlight. This, he declared, was his elixir of eternal youth, brewed from rare herbs found only in the highest mountains of the Orient, mixed with the dew of 1,000 sacred mornings. He claimed it could cure all manner of maladies, from gout and consumption to blindness and lameness. He might even produce a small, seemingly ancient bone or a dried root, claiming it was a powerful relic or a magical ingredient. He would then put on a show. He might employ an accomplice, a young man feigning a limp, who, after a dramatic swig of the elixir, would suddenly leap and dance, proclaiming his miraculous recovery. Or he might appear to touch a blindfolded person, who would then see clearly the trick relying on a carefully placed confederate or a prearranged signal. These performances were designed to inspire awe and belief, especially among the less educated and more desperate. Master Godfrey, watching from the edge of the crowd, felt a flicker of hope. What if this strange man truly possessed a secret? The herbalist had done what he could, but this Dr. Alaric spoke of wonders beyond their ken. Godfrey approached Alaric, his voice trembling with hope. Alaric listened sympathetically to Godfrey's complaints, nodding sagely. He examined Godfrey's gnarled hands, shaking his head with mock solemnity. "Ah, the creeping tendrils of time, good sir," Alaric intoned. "But fear not, for my elixir can halt their relentless march. A single bottle applied daily will restore the vigor of your youth, banishing those aches and pains as shadows flee the sun." He offered Godfrey a bottle of his elixir of eternal youth, for a steep price, perhaps a few silver pennies, a significant sum for Godfrey. He assured Godfrey that the elixir was rare, its ingredients costly, its preparation arduous. Godfrey, desperate for relief, handed over his precious coins, clutching the bottle like a sacred relic. Alaric then swiftly packed his wagon, moving on to the next village, leaving behind a trail of empty promises and lighter purses. The elixir, of course, was nothing more than colored water, perhaps mixed with a bit of alcohol or a common herb for a distinctive taste or smell. It had no medicinal properties whatsoever, beyond perhaps a placebo effect for those who truly believed. Master Godfrey would apply it faithfully, day after day, hoping for a miracle. The pain would not subside, his vision would not clear, and his joints would remain stiff. He would be left not only poorer, but deeply disillusioned, his hope extinguished. Another common miracle cure scam involved the sale of blessed objects or holy water. A charlatan might claim to be a defrocked priest or a holy man with divine powers, selling small vials of ordinary river water, claiming it was blessed by a distant saint capable of curing all ailments. Or they might sell cheap trinkets like wooden crosses or pieces of string, claiming they were infused with healing power from a holy pilgrimage or a celestial event. The elderly, often pious and seeking spiritual solace alongside physical relief, were particularly susceptible to such claims, believing that divine intervention could mend their broken bodies. Records from various medieval monasteries and travel guides speak of pilgrims selling everything from holy dust, from Jerusalem to miracles in a bottle, to gullible travelers and locals. The snake oil peddlers also targeted specific chronic ailments common in old age. For instance, remedies for melancholy or failing memory might be sold, preying on the anxieties of the elderly who feared losing their minds or succumbing to despondency. These cures were often simple concoctions, harmless but useless, yet sold for exorbitant sums based on the desperate hope of the buyer. The impact of these scams was often devastating for the elderly. They not only lost their money, which was often their entire life savings, but they also lost precious time pursuing false hope, delaying or neglecting genuine, albeit limited, medical care available at the time. Their physical suffering remained often compounded by the emotional distress of having been so cruelly deceived. The miracle cure scam preyed on the universal human desire for health and longevity, a desire that became all the more fervent for those facing the frailties of advanced age in a world where true medical relief was a rare commodity. The charlatans, with their theatrical presentations and grand promises, were masters at exploiting these profound vulnerabilities, leaving behind a trail of disillusioned and impoverished victims,